I want to start out by adding some inflammatory words to you guys. I want to start by saying we need a revolution. We need a fundamental change to the design community. We need to change how we work. We need to change our design process. We need to change everything about what we do. We need to come together as designers to develop better products. And the way that we can do that is by bringing back skeuomorphism. I want my books to look like books. I want my shelves to look like shelves. I want my notepads to look like notepads. And my gaming centers to look like felt-covered tables from paintings of dogs playing poker. And I want my Find My Friends apps and geolocation services to look like leather-bound wallets? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just getting your attention, making sure that everybody's awake from lunch. We're not talking about skeuomorphism, so don't worry. Just making sure you guys are all dialed in. So before we get to the actual revolution that I do want to talk about, because I wasn't being hyperbolic when I said that. I think we do need a fundamental change. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about myself. This is me at Disneyland with the glasses from the Toy Story Mania ride. And the reason why I just want to cover a little bit of my background is twofold. Most of the time when I'm meeting with other designers, other people within the product development community, there's often a lot of interest, like not only from me, but I'm interested in other people as well, as far as like, how did we get here? Because, I mean, this is something that we're actively working on right now at Adobe. There aren't any formalized curriculums around experience design. It just doesn't exist. It's not out there. So I think it's always helpful to hear where different people came from to get into this world. But in addition to that, the other reason why I want to kind of go over just a little bit of my background is because it colors a lot of my context. It really informs the way that I see the world as a designer, and the way that I approach my creative process. So knowing where I come from, you can kind of understand why I make some of the decisions I make, and why I see things the way that I see them, even if you fundamentally disagree with them, which might happen. This is all objective, right? This is opinion. Okay, so I first started in UX in around 2003, 2002, with beautiful web-based software like this. So my father, he owned one of the SaaS companies way early. It was basically, hold on to your hats, it was basically GeoCities for Mary Kay directors. So what it did is it made it so that a Mary Kay director could have a web presence, and in that web presence they could put different marketing collateral, they could put training, they could put promotions, and it let them edit that contact without having to pay for a dev. That was the business idea. And so I worked for many years doing tech support and doing tech documentation, but I also dabbled a little bit in the UX of it. I did some first-time user tutorials, and I tried to give some suggestions as far as how it could be updated aesthetically. It didn't go very well because I didn't know what I was talking about. So after that, I went to BYU just down the way, and originally when I went to BYU, the first official major that I was in media music. I was a music major. And it took me about one semester, or half a semester really, to realize that there's way too much of a possibility that I could possibly make money in a music major. So I decided to change to the one major where I knew for sure I would never make money, and that's when I changed to Portuguese. But it ended up being a godsend because through my Portuguese major, I ended up getting a job. Well, I was already working as an instructor at the Missionary Training Center, but I ended up getting a job on their development team. So what that looked like was I was collaborating with the different instructional designers, and we were writing grammar books for missionaries to learn Portuguese. And as part of my responsibilities there, one project that I worked on that was my big aha moment, basically what I did is I designed a web application that a missionary could go to before they went to the MTC to learn little phrases and pieces of grammar. So they weren't going in totally cold. because the Missionaries Training Center was in the middle of this transition to being complete language immersion from day one, not having any English. So we were trying to kind of warm them up to that idea. And I coded it, and I designed it, and I implemented it, and at the end of the whole process, I was like, you know what? The coding's fine. It's not really my cup of tea, but I loved trying to figure out how to make it look good. I loved trying to make it really intuitive and easy to use for these 19-year-old kids that were just shaking in their boots with fear. Like how do I design something for that persona? I didn't know it was called a persona at the time. But that was kind of my aha moment. I was like, you know what, I don't want to write grammar books. I don't want to do translation, thank goodness. That's where I thought I was going to end up. But I wanted to be designing digital products. And so it was at that point that I started looking for jobs. And I still it wasn't a really well-formulated industry at that point. And so I was applying for actual dev jobs, which was terrible, because I would take these dev tests that I was grossly underqualified for. But the foot in the door that I got was at a company in Provo, actually one of my old coworkers from Inside Sales this year, Andrew Young. And it's actually a funny story. I hate applying for jobs. I'm sure you all relate with this. You send out thousands of resumes to these online places where they just disappear into the ether and you have no idea if anybody saw it or if you've been disqualified or if they're considering you. So I got sick of it. So what I did is I went to Burlington Coat Factory. I bought myself a new suit because I just graduated. I went to Cougar Copy in Provo. I printed out 10 resumes, put them in a briefcase, walked into InsideSales.com, found the HR person. I was like, hey, do you have a job? And so about 5 minutes later, I was talking with one of their guys that ran their implementation team. And later that afternoon, I got a call, and they're like, hey, we got a job for you. We want you to be on our implementation team. Here's the pay. And it was a pay cut from the part-time job that I already had. So needless to say, I didn't take that job. But 2 weeks later, the head of product, he was the only product manager at the time, gave me a call, and he says, we've been playing with this idea of hiring a full-time UI designer. That's what they call it. And that's what my title was. The whole time I was at InsideSales.com, UI designer. He said, is this something you'd be interested in? And that was how I did it. That was my foot in the door. And then I busted my tail for 2 years. At one point, I single-handedly was servicing around 200 developers by myself. And I think we got up to 8 product managers, between 5 and 8 product managers, and that was all me. So I got to really figure it out real quick because it was a lot of work. So in doing that, in building my portfolio, I was able to finally kind of transition into a bigger pond with bigger fish. About just over 3 years ago, I moved over to the Adobe team, and many of them are here today. My boss, Ryan, gave an awesome presentation yesterday. And during my time at Adobe, most of the time that I was there and have been there, I worked on the analytics team specifically for just over 2.5 years. And we're going to talk a lot about analytics, so I'm not going to go too much into what we do there. But it was really my opportunity to kind of cut my teeth in this really complex political world. I had to figure out how to not piss everyone off that I worked with. I had to figure out how to really leverage these soft skills and learn how to have soft skills. And I had to learn better presentation, and I had to learn all of these things. And so it was really how I earned my muscles in the enterprise world, being able to kind of operate in that very complex environment. And then about 3 or 4 months ago, or 5 months ago, then I've transitioned a little bit more to, I'm working across a couple different projects that touch multiple products and touch multiple clouds, multiple solutions. And that looks like really, some of it may look boring to you. I think it's awesome, like data privacy. Every designer wants to work on data privacy. But I also get to work on some cool stuff like intelligent agent frameworks, chatbot, voice inputs, in addition to data democratization and some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. Okay, so that's where I come from. That's my context. That's why I see the world the way that I see it as a designer. Now, let's get back to the revolution I was talking about. Now, maybe we don't need to all come together as an army to change the Utah design community. We're doing okay. Let's not kill ourselves here. But we do need to make a fundamental change. And the type of change that I believe we need to make is we need a data revolution in the design community. And this doesn't just apply to Utah. This applies to Silicon Valley. This applies across the board. Even at Adobe, we see this as a huge problem spot where we have a lot of space to improve. And when I'm talking about a data revolution, I'm speaking specifically in reference to digital product design. Now, you'll hear me say a lot the phrase digital product design. And what I mean by digital product design is it kind of encompasses everything. We have this problem in UX, in UI. We have this problem where everybody thinks it means something, or everybody thinks it doesn't mean this, or it does mean this. So I said, you know what, screw it. I'm going to call it digital product design, and that's going to cover everything. So when I say digital product design, I'm talking about the UX, the UI, the user testing, the prototyping, the research, the information architecture, the wireframing. All of that is included in the digital product design. Now, at your given organization, based on how you're kind of set up, you may do only one of those things. I know of organizations where they have somebody who's exclusively assigned to information architecture, who doesn't know how to code, who's just organizing things logically. And at other organizations, you have people who are just researchers. I mean, probably most of the people here, your team has a research-only focused person. The way that we're, for the most part, organized at Adobe, just kind of to open our door and let you see our process a little bit, for the most part, and you guys can keep me honest on my team, we kind of all do all of these at some point. There's a little more emphasis for some people, but at any given point in time in the product design life cycle, we touch every single piece of this. Now, we also have researchers who are user experience researchers, and that's what they do full time. We have a PhD who's incredible, and he runs a team. And then we also have people that are full-time visual designers, and they make our style guides and our style systems. But for the most part, your kind of run-of-the-mill everyday UXer does everything. Our digital product designers. Okay, so that's who we're talking about. So we don't get caught up on UX or UI. Oh, he's not talking about me, I'm talking about everyone. And this isn't just designers. This is digital product design includes product managers. It includes program managers. It includes everybody who is part of the process of creating a digital product. Okay, so this data revolution, it happens at step 0, okay? Now, this is the part of the presentation where I would like to get a little context about where you guys are coming from. We don't have to hear, and we don't have time to hear from every single person, but it's really interesting to me that every digital product designer has kind of a working cadence. You have a process, right? You have a formula that you've been working on of how to go from the beginning to the end. And the end is this beautiful solution that we deliver to the dev team, or we deliver to the stakeholders, or we deliver to the visual designers, and we say this is going to change the world. This is going to make the company millions of dollars, right? But what is the beginning? So what I want to hear from a couple people in the audience is kind of two answers. And they may be the same. Hopefully they are. That'd be awesome. At your organization, or rather, specifically for you, where should the design process start? What is step 0? What is the first step in a design process? And then, in addition to that, I'd also like to know, at your organization, what actually is step 0? Is there a dissonance there? Is there a difference? So do we have anybody willing to kind of open up the sheet so we can know a little bit about your design organization here in the front?
So I would say it should start where you have the first inclination that you can make someone else's life better than it is already. And that could come from a lot of different places, right? But that first inclination is where you go, oh, there's something I could do to make their life better. Now, what what do we need to do to get from here to that spot?
I really like that you used the word inclination. We'll come back to that.
And you could say the first step is first just having an idea or like a thought of, you know, just something randomly pops into your head or something, and you go, oh wait, who would build on this?
Okay, it starts with an idea or with, okay, yeah.
Sort of along with this, I'd say it starts with a need, right? Whether or not the user is aware of that.
Awesome, I like that as well. It starts with a need. Okay, so, and I agree with all of that. That's very much the same way that I see it. And really, the point that I want to make is that designing solutions is easy. Okay? I think as designers, a lot of the time, and we've had to spend the last 10, 15 years really convincing the business that we bring value. Look, we make a solution, we bring value. This solution makes you money, we bring value. And that's so much how we've marketed ourselves, and that's so much how we've presented ourselves to the non-designer community, that I feel like we may have kind of painted ourselves into a bit of a corner. Because what I would propose, again, this is objective, this is opinion, but what I would propose is that the most important thing that we could bring to a company, the thing that will bring the most value long-term to any organization that we work for or work with, is designing problems. Because here's what I found at Adobe. At Adobe, we have crazy smart people, like crazy smart. The engineers we work with are brilliant, especially on the analytics team. Our front-end engineering team is just top-notch. I would put them up against anybody. They're the type of team where you say, okay, here is the must-have, nice-to-have, or must-have, should-have, nice-to-have, if you guys are familiar with that kind of scoping process. And they say, okay, we'll probably get the must-haves, maybe the should-haves, maybe the nice-to-haves. And the next day, they're like, oh, by the way, we just finished all the nice-to-haves last night. They're that good. They are so good. And so what I have found is if we come to the team, the product managers and the program managers and the dev team, with a beautifully designed problem, if the problem perfectly encapsulates what we need to solve, then there's no disagreement. Because it's so obvious what the solution is the easy part. The problem is so well defined that you're like, oh, of course. Yeah, that's exactly how we're going to solve it, because it meets all this criteria of why we need to solve it that way. The solution really becomes the easy part. But then the question is, and this is the step 0, where does that problem come from? What's that in terms of kind of story structure, or if you've ever done any like script or screenwriting, what's the inciting action? What's that catalyst? What's the, I want to make someone's life better? What's the inkling that you have? And where does that come from? And so I teach a class at the University of Utah. We've got a couple of my students here. And even me, I've made the mistake of saying the first thing you need is a problem statement. And that problem statement can come from, does it come from product managers? Maybe it comes from internal innovations, where I just had an idea, or my coworker had an idea. Maybe it comes from the research and development team, hidden away in the basement working on crazy stuff. Or maybe it came from an executive, a stakeholder, who said, you know what, this is what's going to happen, and it must be this way. Is that where, that's where it comes from, right? No, I don't think that's where it comes from. And we do get inklings, we do get ideas that that's where it's come from. But there's a very important clarification that we need to make. That's not where we get the problem, that's where we get the hypotheses. That's where we get the idea. We have not yet said, this is the problem we need to solve. Because as a design community, as we mature, we know, as designers, that when a product manager comes to us, sorry, Andrew, we shouldn't just say, okay, give me the solution and I'll design it. That doesn't make sense, right? That doesn't make sense. That's just putting lipstick on the pig. We shouldn't just say, give me the solution, I'll design it. We should say, give me the problem. Well, I'm saying the next step, the next revolution is saying, give me an idea for the problem, and now we'll design the problem. And there's a reason why that we should never be given a problem. And so to illustrate this, I have a use case that helps me kind of wrap my head around this idea. And before we get there, I'm going to take a quick drink. Okay. In the 1940s, the US Air Force found it had a problem. It found that outside of war, during test flights, where there was no conflict, there was no danger, there was no risk, pilots were crashing and dying. And it was happening a lot. So much that they had to go to the military and say, look, we've got a problem. Pilots are dying, and they're dying because the pilots aren't well enough trained. They need better training. So let's imagine that we're the design team, right? We are the US military design team, all of us collectively. And we're sitting in the room, and the US military product manager, or whatever they call him, comes to us and says, here's the problem. Our pilots need better training. What are we gonna do? We're gonna get to work, right? We're like, let's go to the whiteboards. Let's talk to people. We're gonna go talk to people, we're gonna go design stuff, and we're gonna make the best curriculum design ever, and we're gonna make the best website that delivers that information, and we're gonna get together in a room and we're gonna say, okay, let's go talk to pilots, and let's go talk to officers, and let's go talk to instructors, and we're gonna have this beautifully crafted persona of who the pilot is, and what's his life cycle, and where does he learn, and where does he take that time to learn, and then we're gonna plug that pilot into a cohesive narrative, because that's what we do as UX designers. And we're going to have this awesome narrative of the ideal experience of how he gets trained and how he doesn't miss those things that he's missing that's causing him to crash. And then we're going to use that narrative to come up with different wireframes that's mapped to that narrative so that we can say, okay, so in theory this is how it would work, and we're going to iterate on those wireframes. And then we're going to plug those wireframes into a logical hierarchy that spans the entire space of the problem. We're going to have this beautiful idea, and then at the end we're going to present it to the military, these beautiful mock-ups of the solution to their problem, which are the pilots are not well enough trained, and we feel smug, because we did it. We're awesome, we're designers, we figured it out. We are going to train your pilots better. And you know what? That's exactly what they did. That is exactly, in 1940, what the US military did. And guess what? The pilots kept dying. Nothing changed. Why? It was because the product design team didn't design the right problem. The solution was great, and they even went as far to say, okay, great, this is the perfect solution from the problem that the pilots aren't trained well enough. They even took it a step further, and they didn't say, hey, the product manager just didn't say, okay, you need to redesign this textbook and this communication and this video. They left it open-ended, but that still wasn't enough. And this is why. And if you are going to write down anything or commit anything to memory, this is what I would encourage. You can't design a problem. You can't define a problem without quantitative data. Doesn't work. It's impossible. Okay? Now, we're going to put on our university hats. We're going to step back into the college room for a quick second. And we're just going to do a quick review of the difference between qualitative and quantitative data, because I think that'd be helpful. Okay? So, high level, qualitative data has to do with the qualities that we perceive from the research that we're doing, the attributes that we perceive. It's very objective. It talks about the why of why something's happening, right? Whereas the quantitative data, there's nothing objective about it. It is a hard numerical value. It is a raw data point. And it tells us what is happening and how it's happening. Not necessarily why, we don't know why, it's just raw data. And what I have seen, specifically in the people that I've talked to, and even in the design process at Adobe, is qualitative, we rock at it. I mean, if we are like going to product Hive events and we are following this kind of culture, we get it. We need to go talk to users. We need to do prototyping. We need to test that. That's all qualitative data. We need the quantitative data. And without the quantitative data, we are not going to design the right problem. And the way that these are kind of shown is, like I said, user interviews, user observations, user testing. But when we are defining the problem, when we're designing the problem, are we looking at usage analysis? Are we looking at the raw numbers of how many people are going to our product? Are we using something like segment comparison, where we say, okay, this group of people compared to this group of people, what are the differences that are statistically significant? Are we taking the time to understand that context? Are we doing persona clustering? We're choosing these two different groups of people that we are saying, this is our persona. But is that based on any quantitative data? Are we using a clustering algorithm to look at the raw data points that puts people into statistically significant clusters? I think it's a whole world that we haven't even dipped our toe into. So how did quantitative data solve the pilot deaths? Well, all it did is it designed the right problem. And before we start kicking ourselves, or start kicking them rather, it was actually a pretty easy mistake to make. If I hadn't had the experience that I had with the Adobe Analytics team, I probably would have made the exact same mistake. Because you know what? They probably talked to the pilots, they probably talked to the officers, they probably talked to the instructors, and they're like, look, why is this happening? They went and they did their qualitative research. And they said, why? Why is this happening? Well, I knew Joe. They talked to a pilot, and he's like, I knew Joe. He wasn't that great of a flyer. He wasn't trained well enough. They go and talk to the instructors. Oh, well, yeah, we just don't have that much time with the pilots, so we missed this kind of point of training. They talk to the officers. Oh, he was a slack off. He was probably drunk. He goes to the bars at night. All of this really objective data that ended up that they had designed the completely wrong problem, when all along, the answer was in the data. So as it turns out, the problem was with the design. Back in the 1920s, when they had designed the cockpit for the pilots, here's what they did. They took, I think, 10,000 men, and they measured 20 different measurements. Head height, shoulder width, torso height, depth, every measurement you can imagine. And here's what they did, is they took all of those measurements, and they added them together, and they took the mean. They divided it by the total number, right? And what happened is they came up with this everyman persona. They said, these are all of the data points. This is the average for everyone. And they threw all of those averages into the cockpit, and that was the cockpit. But guess what? If you plug the actual quantitative data back into that everyman, there's not a single man on the planet Earth that has those dimensions. So it fit no one. Every single pilot in the cockpit didn't fit. And they were having to battle with that the whole time. So what did they do? They made the cockpit adjustable. Simple as your car, being able to scoot your seat up. And the death stopped. This whole time they were focusing on curriculum design and training, and all they had to do is put a slider on the seat. Because they designed the wrong problem. So let's continue to refine about that revolution. We need a quantitative data revolution, because I think it's the big missing part of our design process. And like I already said, step 0 is the key. And designing the problem with quantitative data is the key. Now, looking at it in the context of a US Air Force is interesting and it's anecdotal, but it's kind of hard to apply to our everyday process, right? So what does this look like in a digital world? So let's look at a digital product design use case. This is CubeSpace, the company I just invented by putting a font on a colored background. CubeSpace is our client, and their business model is they're basically a Squarespace, but for businesses. This is an imaginary company, I can't stress that enough. This doesn't exist because it's a bad business idea. But if somebody thought it was a good business idea, their whole business strategy would be, okay, we're going to create marketing websites and website collateral and e-commerce platforms for small to medium-sized businesses. Cool, right, more power to you. And so product management, we're all working at CubeSpace. We're all one big design team. And product management comes to us, and they give us this problem statement. our product doesn't offer a payment widget in our WYSIWYG editor. So CubeSpace has a WYSIWYG editor. Everybody know WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. It's a graphical interface with drag and drop. That's how Squarespace is, right? So they say, okay, in our WYSIWYG editor, outside of like WordPress or writing the raw code, we need a payment widget for our e-commerce companies. Because if they can't accept payments, what's the whole point of them using our service, right? And we're like, okay, yeah, I empathize with that. That makes sense. Let's go! But now we know better, right? We're just gonna slow our roll a little bit, and we're going to remember this mantra. Always interview the numbers before you interview the people. Because the numbers are going to give you context. Now, I need to clarify, I'm not saying don't interview people, but I'm saying go to the people armed with quantitative data. And that's how you're going to validate the hypothesis. So let's keep rushing, let's keep that enthusiasm, but instead let's say, let's go to the data. You give me a problem? Rather, you gave me a hypothesis. Let's go prove it. Let's go see what the data says about what you're telling me. So that's what we're gonna do. We're actually gonna jump into the data. We have a data set that I have here that we're gonna look at, okay? And we're gonna use Adobe Analytics to do it. But before we jump into the data, let's set some parameters of kind of what we're looking for. So what we want to avoid is interviewing the wrong customers. So in this hypothetical situation, let's say that this financial service only makes sense for the United States because of some legal issues, okay? So we're basically looking at a fairly defined group of people that we need feedback from. We need people who are using the WYSIWYG editor. We need people who are in the United States, right? And we need people who are currently customers. If we just go to this one working relationship that we have, what if they're not using the WYSIWYG editor? And he said, and I've done this in a user interview before. I've gone in and I'm like, hey, we're looking at adding this functionality to this feature that you don't use. If you used it, would it be good? And they're usually like, yeah, that'd be great. And I can't tell you how many user interviews I've had where they're like, yeah, that'd be fine. That's not good feedback. That's not gonna help you iterate. That's not gonna help you design the right problem. And so we need to make sure that we're understanding this correctly. We need to make sure that when we do the qualitative research, we're doing it with the right people. So what we know, like I said, this is only going to be a feature for WYSIWYG users. So that's the kind of the segment we want to address. It's only going to be available in the US, and this is going to be mostly a feature for users that use e-commerce. Okay? So let's jump into the data. Let's actually do it. There we go. All right. Let's delete this. Okay. So let's think about it. First of all, we need to know people who are coming to CubeSpace, right? So the first thing we want to do is we want to look at visits. And we don't want to just look for this month. That's going to be a pretty small sample size. So let's look for the last year. So we'll do the last 13 full months. We'll go ahead and apply that. And now this is breaking down this data by day. That's not really helpful. That's kind of hard to wrap your head around. So instead, we'll just break this down by month. Okay, and as this loads, great, we're getting a better idea already. So we know that we have 18 million people who have come to CubeSpace in the last 13 months. We're killing it. That's a pretty big number, right? Pretty big number of visits. So we need to understand that specific segment of data that we're looking for. We need people who are using the WYSIWYG. And the easiest way to do that is we say, okay, actually let's make this full screen real quick. Okay. We want people who are performing the action. So we know that in the WYSIWYG, there's a drag and drop interface, right? So if somebody has performed that action of dragging and dropping, they're in the WYSIWYG. So we'll just filter by that. We'll just type in drag and drop component. That'll work. And now, and let's actually compare that to the whole bucket of user data. So it's about 10%, right? We have 18.3 million visitors in the past 13 months, and only 1.5 of those are using the WYSIWYG. Well, the first red flag, right? Should we actually be developing this product? That's a really small market segment. Is the dev time going to be worth the effort? And as designers, we can take that to the product team. We'd be like, look, we don't know if the money's there. But then, there's actually something interesting going on with this data. If we trend this data on a line chart, this is hard to see. Where are you, line? There you are. Okay. And let's normalize it. So, because we're working with two pretty different. This is actually really interesting. So this blue line with the spikes and the divots is our overall usage, right? But the green line is our WYSIWYG users. It's on the rise. So we talk to our product managers and we're like, hey, we're not sure if the market opportunity is there, but we're seeing this trend in the data that it's going up. And they say, yeah, that's because WYSIWYG's the future. That's where we're putting all of our dev resources. That's our focus. That's what we're pushing our customers towards. That makes sense. We see it in the data, right? Data's going up. So we say, okay, cool. But that's for all users. What if we're a hugely international company? That's not going to buy us a lot. So we need to know specifically for the United States. So we just search real quick for country. We can go into the countries. We want to look specifically for the United States. We drag that on as an additional filter. And that goes from 1.5 million down to, actually I'm going to get rid of this visualization so it doesn't slow us down. And it deleted everything. Good thing we have undo. There we go. We're down from 1.5 million to 596,000. That segment's looking smaller and smaller, but even still, we're gonna go smaller because we know that this is only specifically for e-commerce. Luckily, I have created beforehand this e-commerce companies segment, and we're all the way down from 18 million at the beginning of this analysis. And that's basically the breadth that we would have had at the beginning. We're down to 163,000. But again, that's visits. That's not 163,000 people that have gone. That's 163,000 times people have gone. So we're going to change it from visits to unique visitors, how many actual people, and we're down to 19,000. And so now we want to know, okay, cool, we're getting there. We're getting really close to what we need to know. But if we're going to set up user interviews, and we're going to go out and talk to these 19,000 people who are e-commerce companies in the United States that are using the WYSIWYG, who are they? Well, luckily, we're in analytics. We have the data. So we just change it from month to company. And once it loads, we know we're going to go talk to JCPenney. Makes sense. They're an e-commerce company. They're in the United States. And apparently they're using the WYSIWYG editor. And so we've taken this entire confusion around who do we talk to? How do we talk to them? What's the context? And now we know. We have such a better idea of the problem that we're solving. We know that it's a smaller sample size that's using the WYSIWYG. We know that it's not as highly adopted as, say, the people that are using the WordPress templates or who are coding it themselves on our services. But we have that context. We're not going into this blind anymore. And we have a list of companies that we can talk to. Okay. Enough of that. Let's bring this around and kind of tie this all together. So the main thing that we gained from going to the quantitative data is we got context. We're going to go into that qualitative data gathering armed. We're going to have ammunition. We're going to really actually understand the problem, and we're not going to design new books when they just need a slider on their seat. Now, I get it. Probably a lot of you are like, okay, that's pretty cool. I don't have that. How in the world do I get access to that data? Like, where is the data? How do you get it? What tools are you using for analysis? So, my first little plug, subtle, is to buy Adobe Analytics. Now, I say that, this is not like a paid endorsement by Adobe for Product Hive, not at all. I am saying that because a big part of my job is to understand the market atmosphere around analysis tools. And if you look at other analysis tools, you can't do a lot of the things that I did. It's just not possible. It's very, very difficult with web data. So if you don't, but here's the fact of the matter is Adobe is an enterprise product with an enterprise price tag. I get that. So if you're working at your first 50-person startup, you're not going to go to the CEO and convince him that he should buy Adobe Analytics. That's probably not going to happen. I get it. So I did want to put up some other options. Pendo.io is decent. Hive Analytics, I actually don't mind. They have a single line of code that you can implement on your website, and then they have pretty interesting ways of querying the data that's a little more friendly to someone who hasn't done analysis in the past. And then there's Google Analytics. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many other additional analyses. Like, I would love to take the time to show you guys how to use a flow diagram in order to understand what's the next steps. We can say, okay, somebody used the WYSIWYG to drag. What was the next thing they did? And what did they do after that? And how did those segment drops-offs, and how does that segment compare to people who renew their licenses next year? The opportunities are endless. So, if you want to talk more about it, find me afterwards. And it looks like I'm at about time, so let's turn it over for any questions you guys have.
So you talked about that there's some technical limitations you specifically addressed the analytics tool, okay? But how about for organizations that maybe aren't as data-driven and maybe they have the data somewhere but no one's really looking for it? What kind of suggestions can you give us about how to get the data to the point where, oh, you can just drag and drop and go these cool insights? You know?
So there's kind of two approaches to that. The first is whether or not your team has an analysis team. If you have an analysis team, the number one best thing you can do is just buddy up with them. And then you can start leveraging, if they're holding the data in other places, there's a huge learning curve, but you can use things like Tableau. Anything's going to be better. You can even just look at it in an Excel spreadsheet. Anything is going to be better than nothing. Now, if there isn't an analysis team, chances are they're not tracking data at all. So you need to look at options such as Heap Analytics, where they have the single line and they start doing the tracking for you, or the curse word Google Analytics, where they store that data for you. In the future, hopefully, Adobe will have a much more streamlined offering of how you can track and do all those things at a much better provisioning process. But the real answer, and our data platform team is here so they can keep me honest, but the real answer is there isn't a good solution right now. Nobody's really figured it out. And that's why there's a big opportunity for the person to figure it out.
Do you feel like there's a cost as far as your other skills go when you start focusing so much on data?
Well, so specifically the way that I've seen it at Adobe, the way that we kind of, it's more than anything, it's been setting expectations with the teams who are waiting on you, right? Because you don't want to be the bottleneck. And that's kind of, I think, what you're getting at, right? You're spending this time doing analysis and learning how to do analysis. Are you letting your visual design kind of atrophy? Are you letting your wireframing and information hierarchy atrophy? If you, what we have found, or what I have found to be the most effective, and this is specifically within my circle, so it may not apply to every situation, is just setting expectations. If you say, look, if you want us to do this right, we need this much time, and in your provisioning, in your estimates, include that time for the analysis. And as long as you set that expectation, you can keep working on those other aspects at the same time to keep them fresh, but you just are starting to change the mentality of the company, and you're saying, no, we don't start with the solution handed to us and just put lipstick on it. Let us do our job. Let us help you. And you really start to collaborate with them, and they become, the way that I've put it in other places is you deputize them as designers. And you're saying, we're all figuring this out together, and part of that design process that you're participating in is analysis. And so as far as keeping your other skills up to snuff, I mean, I don't think, I haven't seen a huge atrophy in my other skills as I've tried to be more data-driven. More than anything, it's just made me a better designer in every kind of aspect. I think I saw one back there, yeah.
So, with the data revolution you're talking about, you feel that some companies are so focused on that they're sacrificing the other sets of data and other things because it's so, it's just with the numbers being and this is what it means at the end of the day and that's all that matters. The other parts get sacrificed.
Absolutely, and I think that's why it's really important to re-emphasize the point that this does not mean you don't do everything we already know that we should be doing. This is just to further enrich in that process. We still have to talk to people. We're designing products for people, and if we don't humanize it, if we don't talk to people, that, to your point, that data is worthless. It doesn't give it any color. So we still need to do that. We still need to do the wireframing and the prototyping and the testing. But I think we just have to help them understand that this is one more piece of the puzzle and not that we need to change everything and only focus on this. Anything else?
So we're currently just trying to decide on how to better take our data and quickly use it. We're looking into Deep Analytics. We have our own tracking that we do. How would you say that the Adobe Marketing Cloud, we have Google Analytics, the first word or whatever, but how do we better utilize it? Because we have data, how to better utilize it. I know that's a big question.
No, and that is what you just described is a huge focus of what we spend a lot of our time thinking about. And what I have seen, kind of anecdotally for myself, and the reason why I say Google Analytics curse word is because they are often shown in like enterprise data analysis comparisons as our peer, and I just think that's the most ridiculous comparison. Because the big thing that you miss, even with Heap as great as they're doing, and Pendo as great as they're doing, and Google as great as they're doing, it's all very, it's not flexible. These breakdowns where you're breaking it down by country, and the interface and the experience to do those breakdowns really don't exist in those other products. And so the way that I've described it to people is this analysis workspace, it's actually pretty new. It's only been around about 1.5 years or 2 years, I think. The way I describe it is it's like Photoshop, but for data. It's an intuitive way that I can dig into data. And it's something that isn't as relevant or as available. There are different tools that if you already have the data set, you can plug it into. And what I would suggest to poke around with is Tableau. Tableau is kind of the industry standard, but there's a pretty steep learning curve. One that is a little more accessible is Microsoft Power BI. It does somewhat similar things, but as far as just really breaking down data really quickly, I haven't personally found something that I'm more comfortable with than the analysis workspace. But that's really biased because that's the product I worked on. So that would be my suggestion, to look, especially if you already have the data stores and you already have the raw data. Excel, Tableau, Power BI, I think are the best place to start. All right, I think I'll close it off there. Thanks so much, guys.